session. I think in the first part of the seminar that we have explored the kind of different relationships between the key concepts that we have put into the theme of this seminar. It's a freedom, civil society, and the state. And but we are talking about these three concepts in the context of the possible role or roles of religion. Though two of the speakers talk about that from the Christianity, this particular religion. But surely I think we can explore the ideas from a wider angle. It's about the other religions. What might be the role of other religions in the protecting the freedom, in the cultivating or shaping the civil society, and also limiting or causing the state to adopt certain kind of policies or laws. All these things will all be they're connected in a way. So I think after hearing the views of from the speakers, it's time for a discussion. And if you have any ideas or any questions you want to raise to the two speakers, and or some of the things in Dr. Jonathan Chaplin's paper, you may also raise. And also, surely, I think we have a lot of time, and we could have a good dialogue. And I don't like seminars that we just come and hear the speakers, what the speakers want to say, and then that's the end. I think it's more important that the speakers here, we present our views, is just to trigger or inspire more thoughts on how we can approach the matters. So your views are most welcome. So you maybe when you ask question or you want to put forward your ideas, just briefly introduce yourself so that we know who you are, and I thought that will provide a better base for us to have a good dialogue. So it's open to you. Anyone? Yeah.
Thank you. Maureen Tilbrook, I was an educator in Hong Kong until I retired. I think that the idea of dialogue is obviously crucial, and Dr. Fu's suggestion of placing religious freedom center stage seems to be a very positive one. But how much confidence can we have that Chinese policy will change, given the communist ideology and the fear of the current Chinese government? We are only too well aware in Hong Kong of the curbing of civil and religious freedoms, certainly in China, and also to some extent here in Hong Kong. So what level of confidence do we think we can have in change?
That's a $1 million question. Well, I think, we always have to keep hope, right? And that's why when National Security Advisor Susan Rice asked me, basically with a huge frustration, she said, I have talked with President Xi Jinping, Premier Li Keqiang, Minister Meng Jianzhu, all these, names of the prisoners and the policy issues, and why things are actually getting worse, right? So everybody is kind of frustrated, but my argument is actually, if you continue to advocate and speak loud and clear, at least you wouldn't miss the opportunity to make these issues known to the current, Chinese regime. And certainly, in a practical way, as we have seen in the past really few weeks, the newly proposed religious regulation, according to which the more restrictions will be imposed to not only the independent kind of a house church or other independent religious groups, even the government-sanctioned religious groups will be much more regulated. For instance, if you do charitable work. During the Hu Jintao's time, there were, to his credit, I think there are more kind of more freedom, at least. You see the government-sanctioned church groups are allowed at least to engage with more social kind of charitable works and in the name of their faith. But now, according to the new regulations, it's totally forbidden. So you can't even offer a prayer before, you kind of engage earthquake relief, all these things. So this is a very worrisome sign. But again, I think partially the pessimistic mood was honestly caused by what I call almost, appeasement policy by the major Western countries. And I remember a few years ago when I accompanied, the barefoot lawyer Chen Guangcheng to the European Union at Brussels, and we were escorted into an important meeting. The EU's highest rank official in charge of the EU Human Rights Dialogue, the former Foreign Minister of Greece, kind of beginning his remarks by telling Chen Guangcheng that EU did care about him and sent a diplomat to his village, but was beaten up. And Chen Guangcheng said, I didn't know that. Of course, he was under house arrest. And my follow-up question is, nobody knew, that a EU diplomat was even beaten up nearby Chen Guangcheng's village. Why did you guys, even, not even release a press release, and hold a protest, a formal protest? And the answer is, we did protest, and in our annual Human Rights Dialogue, and in a closed-door meeting, and we told our Chinese counterpart that, why did you beat up our diplomat? And he just simply want to visit Chen Guangcheng. And the Chinese negotiator, the in charge of the dialogue, said, really? We have never done that. That's the end of the story. There's no further action was taken. So I think, if a multifaceted, as I just, advocate again and again, approach that, a human rights, religious freedom centered, not only just, once in a year, sometimes, the human rights dialogue was even put in Guizhou or, somewhere in the remote area. Nobody even knew there is a human rights dialogue. But really elevate this issue with trade. Trade is a very important component with the labor issue, human rights issue. And religious freedom, can be really extended in many parts of the different facets of the bilateral or, multilateral level. So that's kind of, I think, what I advocated, the multifaceted and also in the highest level. During the President Bush time, when I organized a delegation to Washington, D.C., with the Chinese human rights lawyers, usually twice a year, I don't need to really make an appointment to get into the White House, directly go to the National Security Council. Every time, I just go to the White House and make a phone call, and we are always let in. So I said, White House is like our house. But then, in the past 7.5 years, only before President Obama's last trip to China, it's become a lame duck president. That was the first time I was invited into the White House, along with the activists from the Uyghur American Association, from the International Campaign for Tibet, from other human rights lawyers, kind of the victims of the family members. None of them was invited even to go to a meeting in the White House. So you tell me, how much kind of a priority in the administration. And but we need to keep pushing. Yeah.
I don't have any comment to make in relation to China, but I would make comment in relation to the biblical tradition. One of the great themes of the Bible is "Let my people go," and there's some interesting characteristics around what that looks like. If you're familiar, obviously, with the story of Pharaoh and the Jewish people in captivity, one of the striking verses around the idea of the captivity is where it says that God allowed Pharaoh's heart to be hardened in order that he might bring judgment upon him. And you see this theme elsewhere in the Old Testament. In the book of Daniel, you'll be familiar with the figures Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar and Darius. And each of those, it says in chapter 5 of the prophet Daniel, refused to acknowledge the sovereignty of God. And in the case of Nebuchadnezzar, it says that he was driven mad and ate the grass of the earth until he did recognize the authority of heaven. On Friday, something remarkable happened in Iran, and you can see pictures of this on YouTube from last year. You can look it up. Thousands of Iranians gathered in the desert at the tomb of Darius the Great. Why did they gather at the tomb of Darius the Great? Thousands tried to make their way there and were sent back by the authorities. But you can see the pictures from last year on YouTube, and it's possible that the pictures are again on YouTube, gone on just this weekend. I haven't looked yet. So why did they go to the tomb of Darius the Great? Well, there is a spherical cylinder in the British Museum from the time of Darius that is felt to be the first declaration of religious tolerance ever produced. And Darius the Great was the first head of an empire, it is argued by some archaeologists and historians, who put in place religious tolerance. Certainly, if you again look at the biblical record, I think Darius is mentioned 44 times in the Old Testament. And in fact, there's a debate in the book of Isaiah as to whether second Isaiah, this character of second Isaiah is because the name Darius, if you take the historicity of Isaiah absolutely literally, Darius is named as a great liberator of the Jewish people even before Darius was born. So that's why you have the argument around second Isaiah. But even so, we know from the record that Darius not only declared religious tolerance in Babylon and then the Assyrian Empire, but he made provisions, if you look at the books of Nehemiah and Ezra, for the restoration of the temple as the place of worship for the Jewish people. So there is this, and the other point I'd make around this from a religious dimension is that there's only one other person in the whole of the Bible referred to as the Messiah or the Anointed One apart from Christ, and that's Darius the Great. So he's an interesting character, and therefore the idea of religious tolerance, specifically the idea of letting my people go out of the idea of captivity, is linked to the messianic work, if you like, of God in history. And the last comment I'd make in relation to the history is I began my journalism in East Central Europe in the 1980s. And of course, at that time, and I wonder what your perspective is on this, none of us could have imagined that the USSR, which of course was repressive of religious liberty, could exist one day and be gone the next. And of course, that is the point about the book of Daniel, that people who are at the heads of great empires like Nebuchadnezzar could be quite quickly brought down the next, because God allows the rulers' hearts to be hardened in order that he might bring judgment on them.
Yep, thank you. Any question or comments? Yep.
Hi, my name is John. I'm a high school student. I just wanted to ask, because Dr. Bob and to some extent Mr. Chaplin as well, you spoke about Christianity as having a meaningful role in the trajectory of creating a liberal democracy. But do you not feel that the situation, the circumstances found in China as per their relationship with Christianity is very different from the circumstances that were facing the European countries themselves, and in a way it's more delicate regarding the way they view religion, as in whether it's seen as foreign interference and whether that could still play a meaningful role in China's trajectory towards a more accountable state?
Yeah.
Certainly, the context in China related to Christianity is very different from what you mentioned in the European or American context. And after all, the kind of Christianity existed in China is really since 1807, right? And it's relatively a young church. And in 1920s, when the communism was kind of emerging, there was called anti-Christianity movement, actually purposely instigated. Now scholars agree by the communists themselves. So the kind of antagonistic view against Christianity can be traced to many years, even before the PRC was established. And I think, the kind of perception that Christianity is regarded as a Yangjiao, the foreign religion, pretty much, I think, have passed that time. I think Chinese, the overall Christian community, now even under the severe kind of limited participation in the public square, under many circumstances with vast discrimination and persecution, already I think are accepted, I think, as part of the faith community, a dynamic faith community in China. For instance, in 2008, this is the Chinese Ministry of Civil Affairs own statistics, that when the Sichuan earthquake happened, the first really group of these responders, rescuers, that entered into the earthquake rescue effort, the majority of them are from the Christian community. Actually, many of them from the house church movement, right? I think we have even somebody here in the audience is a witness over there and have been there. So I think, ironically, after the first month of rescuing work, and many Christians even chose to stay there to rebuild schools, to provide counseling. I think really that has maybe the first step, the first major event, Christians step into the public kind of arena. And of course, I would always try to at least persuade or try to convey the message to the current Communist Party leaders that, generally there is a famous saying among the Christian community that there's one more Christian, one less criminal, one more church, one less prison. So instead of perceiving, Christianity as a threat, actually, those, wherever there are churches, really, even underground churches, even those who are persecuted, instead of walking to the street and engaging the normal kind of civil protest, you have how many kind of protests have you seen, organized by the Christian churches, by the Catholic churches? Very, very few, right? And I have, witnessed so many occasions, those who are even tortured, in the most extraordinary way, with kind of unspeakable pain. They are still in the court when they are tried. They pronounced a sense of forgiveness, a sense of love to the judge, to their persecutors. And I think, that itself tells, we're talking about a civil society and freedom and how we can, build that, I think Christianity, the Christian community should and will play a very major part, I think, in the transition of China from a dictatorship to a post-communist democratic country. So my suggestion to the Communist Party, I used to work in the Communist Party, I said, okay, you either adjust and voluntarily, or you will force to do something that you don't want to see yourselves being met. I think there's so many other factors of the society will really make true kind of a threat to the party's existence, not a Christian community.
Oh, I cannot speak totally on behalf of Jonathan, but I think when I read his paper, he talked about the Christian role, not necessarily that we will be taking the same kind of political paths as the European states in reaching a democratic system, but rather I think it's the core. It's about cultivating the kind of citizenship needed for the change, and so Christians might play the role in the government, but also in the opposition. That actually the example would be here in Hong Kong, that we have the umbrella movement. Actually, people have already studied about that. That's a high percentage of participation of Christians in the umbrella movement. Not that actually the whole issue was very divisive within the church, but Christians being inspired by the idea and then they participate. And you can also find Christians in the government. In some way, I think their work helped the crackdown. There was no blood, it's bloodless crackdown. I think that no bloody crackdown, I would say. That may be also the role of Christian played in that change. So no one could foresee the future, what might be the path. It will be very unlikely to be the same as the European path. But as the Christian beliefs will shape the certain ideas and way of thinking and also the practice of citizens, then change will happen. Okay?
And my only quick comment on this is to say, again, from the historical, but admittedly from the Western perspective, Jonathan does say that China has to make its own way. But in 1939 and in 1940, under totalitarianism, Christians were locked up in the jails of Europe. In 1945, the people that were sprung from the jails that then entered into government, you're talking about De Gasperi in Italy, Monet in France, and other Christian Democrats in France and Belgium. Obviously, Erhard, the German economics minister, and Adenauer, the chancellor. So Christians who were in the prisons one minute under totalitarianism entered into government at the heads of Christian democratic parties. In 1989, when communism came down in East Central Europe, exactly the same thing happened, where there was figures, Catholic intellectuals like Mazowiecki, the Polish foreign minister, or Józef Antall, the Hungarian prime minister, another Catholic intellectual, or whether today the president of Germany, who was a German Baptist from Sibiu. These are figures that are motivated from a faith perspective, who obviously participate in the leadership of the new emerging well, they're not new anymore, but the emergent democracies of East Central Europe once the Iron Curtain fell.
Yes, I appreciate you all for your
Use the mic, yeah. The button, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Robert Precht. I'm Director of Justice Labs based in New York, and I worked for 4 years in Beijing running a rule of law program. I found your remarks interesting and stimulating, and I want to kind of present a counter view and ask for you to comment on this. One of the views that I frequently encountered in Beijing on the part of the government and others who looked dimly upon US-funded rule of law programs operating in Beijing, one of the views I heard frequently was the idea that, well, you Americans pretend and promote the idea of human rights being a universal value, and that as a universal value, human rights, like gravity, applies equally in New York City as it should in Beijing. That human rights is something that transcends particular value systems, political systems. But in fact, these critics would say to me, human rights is nothing but a religion. It's a Western religion. And as evidence of that, they point to the same evidence as our speakers today about the very close coexistence between Christian tradition, other religious traditions, religious tolerance, and human rights. Now, my question really is it's really for you to comment is, do you think that the argument that you're making, and it's a compelling argument, that there is a very close association between Christianity and human rights and between religious freedom and human rights, do you think that view may actually play into the hands of authoritarian regimes like China that say, well, okay, we agree with you, it's a form of Christianity or it's a form of religious tolerance, but it's a religion, and we have the right and we have a long-standing tradition of a different value system, Confucianism or whatever you call it. So I would like to hear how you would respond to those critics that basically pose this question to me. I'm sure you can come up with a much better answer than I did.
Well, the answer I would give by observation is to say they're not the only ones. You could argue that same argument that you're saying you heard in Beijing, you could hear in Tehran, you could hear in Jeddah. Any opponent of human rights will find a rationale to defeat human rights. And I would say that the difficulty we have in the West is particularly in relation to the Middle East at this time. And they may observe that where the West looks to impose a secular narrative or a human rights-based democratic secular vision on unwilling people, the Middle East is the great riposte to that. All you've seen is a catastrophic reaction to this. But I would say in relation to the Middle East that where we strip out the Christianity, where we strip out the fundamental dignity of the individual that you see in the Gospels, and you offer a secular vision of human rights, the reaction, at least in religious countries such as the Middle East, you think of Iran or Syria or Iraq, is to say, well, Christianity has lost its confidence as a worldview that has any meaning anymore. And you see contemporary Christian political theologians, I'm not saying that Jonathan takes this view, but he's fairly close to it, that you can create a God-free body of or corpus of ideas. And when Christians lose confidence, Muslims then say, you have no respect for your God, you have no confidence in him. And actually what we're seeing in the Middle East is a violent reaction against the secular imposition of a worldview, which they believe doesn't honor the sovereignty of God. And so actually I think there's some danger, the point I'm making is this, is that there's actually some danger when you strip God out of the picture and you create a secular. I think there's as much danger in that. So that would be my perspective, is to simply say that views in Beijing are not unique just to them, but you see this reaction against this connection between Christianity and human rights in closed societies everywhere.
From my experience, of course, you have worked at Raleigh program in Beijing. They may use that program, use that kind of as a good excuse, but the reality is the very concept of human rights in the modern time, the so-called universal, human rights, is actually was accepted when 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Actually, China played a very important part. The Chinese government, the then Chinese government, and further, it was not even a Christian kind of led group that drafted, that Universal Declaration. And it has, Buddhist, you have all kinds of, the faith groups from different backgrounds. And so I think, to deny that there is universal kind of a human rights, this concept self is practically very contradictory to, what China has participated. And in the old days, before I left China, China was denying, actually, there is a universality of human rights, and they called for a relativistic idea. And I would also go further, usually in more practical argument, is actually, if look at China, basically, the benefit to respect or implement those universal values, such as religious freedom and human rights, actually will help what the ideals, even at least on the surface, the Communist Party is advocating, such as a harmonious society, such as economic development, such as the kind of social reconstruction, the rebuilding. And China, I think, facing a dramatic crisis on the morality, on the social ethics, and family disintegration, and materialism. Is already, in a very dangerous level, and I kind of picked up this quote from Dr. Brian Graham, who used to be the Pew charitable researcher, and perhaps now perceived as the #1 scholar on religious freedom and economic prosperity. He and Roger Fink, F-I-N-K-E, wrote this book called The Price of Freedom Denied, Religious Persecution and Conflict in the 21st Century. They conducted a robust statistical analysis of religious freedom conditions and incidents of conflict in 143 countries. Here is the conclusion. I think we can tell the Communist Party, whether it's appeal or not. It says, I quote, "To the extent that governments and societies restrict religious freedoms, physical persecution and conflict increases," end the quote. So you want to build a more prosperous, economy. And actually, Brian Graham also did another separate kind of study on that, and built a very solid argument that a sustainable economic development in a country can only happen with religious freedom being protected and maintained. So so Brian Graham, G-R-I-M, and if you deny that freedom, actually you increase the risk of more kind of social unrest and conflicts. So I think, they may not believe it, but, we have to argue and present the best statistics and argument.
Max Weber's pretty good on this subject too.
Yes, I think we will have other, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Isabella Liu. I'm a researcher in here, Hong Kong U Law. I have some questions for Mr. Campanelli. You described the loss of this Christian value in BBC and the problems happen. What are the reasons for such loss? And do you see this as a trend happening? And are there any ways to revert such a loss? Thank you.
Well, I think we're all familiar with, it's a good question that you ask. I mean, we're all familiar with the Enlightenment, the benefits of the Enlightenment. But one of the downsides of the Enlightenment was the sustained idea, and you can trace it back to Voltaire and others, of the idea that God is very much in a different sphere. He exists outside of the human dimension and should remain there. And therefore religion has to be engaged exclusively with matters of heaven and the spiritual, and that the claims of the spiritual have no basis in the world as it is, in the physical world as it is. And the tragedy, I think, of Enlightenment thinking is that we begin to change our concept of God to fit our human ideology. So you'll be familiar with this concept of deism. It's the idea that God has created the world and he's now withdrawn. He's established certain immutable natural laws, and the world as it exists is sustained by these natural laws. And the business of politics is to identify the effective working of these natural laws, but God sits outside of history and sits outside of what goes on in the world as we know it. But of course, the biblical understanding of God is not deistical at all. It's the idea that God is very much reveals himself in particular moments in history. And it's the idea, and I'm saying that it's very much the British political tradition, that God continues to reveal himself on the stage of human activity. And therefore he's active today, and he reveals himself today. And therefore the challenge for those who have a faith perspective is to ask themselves this question: what are God's ways and how does he reveal himself? That is to say, what act of human volition brings about the manifestation of God's kingdom, that sees God's kingdom established? So therefore, I've identified to you what I think is the problem of the impact of Enlightenment thinking on the church. I'm not surprised that the secular world rejects the claims of God. What I want to challenge is for Christian leaders who surrender the idea that God is active in history, or they reduce it to very unspecific claims on human for actions of human goodness. So I'm arguing and that God is continuing to make claims on institutions. A famous Anglican theologian called Professor Oliver O'Donovan argues in his book, which I think is one of the greatest political works of theology of the last quarter of a century, called The Desire of the Nations. He says that we need to rediscover politics as the sphere of God's self-disclosure. This idea that history is about the acts of disclosure of God. And he says that not only individuals can experience salvation, but families, cities, nations can. And so the question then is, that you've put, your last question is, can we restore a faith perspective in the BBC? Well, this question is no different to a gospel question. Is the BBC as an institution any different to a nation? Can it change? Is repentance, to use the Greek phrase metanoia, a changing of minds, is it possible? Well, of course, the answer is yes, of course it's possible. The challenge for the Christian community in Britain, our Christian leaders, whatever denomination, is to have confidence that the claims of the gospel genuinely are transformative. And so you have to believe that there is power in the gospel. Is there power in the gospel? Well, then, if there is power in the gospel, then repentance brings transformation. If there is no power in the gospel, well, of course, you're wasting your time. And as I believe that there is power in the gospel, I would say that truth claims made to institutions like the BBC or other institutions that are relevant in Britain today, there is still a need to make those claims, and it is still possible for institutions like the corporation to change. So I'm a born optimist.
My name is Mark Sheldon. I'm from the Chinese University. I'd like to ask the three of you about your views of the current role of the Catholic Church in human rights activity. Obviously, we had a certain concept of human rights advocacy under Pope Benedict, and now we have a very different tone and approach under Pope Francis. And as Benny has pointed out, it's quite striking how many of the leaders and activists here in Hong Kong are Catholic. And they have a certain notion of activity in the political life of our city. The problem of the Catholic Church in China, of course, is a very unique one because it has ecclesiastical and governance issues, but it also has foreign policy and diplomacy aspects. So I'd like to ask the three of you in the different contexts how you see the change, if there is any change, either in tone or in policy related to Pope Francis and the current role of the Vatican.
I think I do not have the sufficient information to answer your question. But as I see the matter, again, it's about the people. The real thing is about the people. It's not the institution that I'm thinking of. That the Catholic teaching, actually I learned quite a lot from the social teaching of the Catholic Church, like the principle of subsidiarity. That I think is a very important principle that could be transformed into actual policy matters. And so if the social teaching of the Catholic Church, I think will surely continue to develop and shape the present generation of Catholic in Hong Kong and how they will participate in social actions. I cannot tell the differences or the big differences between the previous Pope and the present Pope, except that I can see that the present Pope wants to maintain or wants to develop a better relationship with China. And that's caused maybe some compromises in matters in China, the Catholic in China, or the attitudes towards human rights issues in China. But I hope that will not happen just because of this rebuilding this kind of, or making a more official relationship between the Vatican and the Chinese government will cause the laws of this kind. Taking a more positive side, would this relationship rebuilding would allow the Vatican to have more influence over the Chinese policies towards religion. Now, it may be too naive to a lot of people that, well, you're just too naive, you're dealing with communists. And so again, it's about the power of gospel and the power of the wisdom from God. Would that be that by rebuilding the relationship, would that allow more room for Catholic in China to at least to practice their religion? And if they have the room to practice their religion, I think change may bring and change may come at some point of time. But I don't know what's the real intention behind it. It may be really political. It may be purely political consideration rather than this kind of consideration. I don't know. I just have no information on this point.
I was in Rome just a few weeks ago and stayed with a senior academic in the Gregorian, which is the pontifical university that trains 80% of all bishops around the world. And I asked him the same question. And he said that he expects there to be a development in relation to the Catholic Church and the government in Beijing, and that we're awaiting it. So in terms of church relationship with the state, we are awaiting how that relationship develops. But I agree with Benny that I believe in keeping the institutions of the state and the church separate, but as you've heard me argue, I believe that the institution of the state itself should acknowledge Christ, and that this isn't about church government, it's about the humility of the state in the face of a sovereign God. And the principle I've argued is the idea that if we humble ourselves, God lifts us up. And if we don't humble ourselves, God will. So for me, the space that it's possible for Catholics to be active in Hong Kong and elsewhere is a civic space, and that Christian vision itself is worth pursuing in terms of the transformative power of Christian service in the world. You've heard Bob talk about the Christian response to the Sichuan earthquake, and I just think that is the kind of space of Christian service, that kind of vision of self-giving. I think that's still possible regardless of the relationship between one institution and another institution.
Well, I mean, it's a very hot issue right now. I feel, first of all, really commend the Catholic community in Hong Kong, really, in many sense, kind of serve as a leading force for advocacy for human rights and practice their faith in a very meaningful way, such as, the Cardinal Zen, right? Cardinal Zen, and, I was very touched back in March when I was here. He was or more than 80 years old, right? Still march on the street and to lead the effort for justice. And the question about the apparently imminent announcement for Vatican-China normalization of relationship, to me is, I think, is really whether, or how much the both sides will compromise on the key issue of the authority of appointment of bishops, right? I think, to me, is a very much a doctrinal issue. It's a religious issue. It's not a issue that the Caesar. So the argument I think some Vatican diplomats use that, okay, let God, kind of God be God, kind of Caesar be Caesar. But that issue, I think, should not be regarded as the state has to play the role to qualify who is, qualified to be a bishop or who is not. And especially an atheistic state, what kind of qualification they have to offer that one candidate is better over the other, except a political consideration, whether it's loyal to the Communist Party or not, then you compromise your faith. I think it would be a huge mistake if Vatican did not, make that principle upheld in the negotiation. So that's, I think, essentially, I agree with the Cardinal Zen that is, if in exchange for the political expediency for diplomatic relations, but sacrificing that fundamental principles the Catholic Church has practiced for so many ages, just for China's sake, is a betrayal. I think for the past 60 years of tremendous suffering, and continue, many are still suffering, of the underground Catholic Church. So that's what I feel.
Okay, yep. Yeah.
This is a question to Mr. Campanelli. Basically, you said previously that you believed in the separation of church and state as a concept, and you're not talking about church government. But at the same time, you said that the government should have an official recognition of the role of God and the Christian God in democracy. I would like to see your opinion on those who say that even that would be excessive, particularly in the case of the BBC dedication of BBC, where many would say that we need to keep the public sphere a completely neutral and unbiased place and inclusive space for all religions, and that we say we either accept all religions from dedicating that place. So you would have a Christian minister dedicated and then a Satanist, for example, which may not always be compatible, or no religion have the right to dedicate public spaces. How would you demarcate acceptable affiliations of the church and state and unacceptable affiliations with the church and state?
So as Bob was saying, I don't see any role for the state in the appointment of bishops. Although interestingly in the UK, of course, the head of state, the monarch, is the head of the Church of England, which is itself a bizarre and curious a reality. But my riposte to you is to question your premise. And this has been the argument that I've been trying to make. Is it possible to create a secular space where human rights are guaranteed, where individual liberty is fundamentally the dominant characteristic of the state? And my argument is I'm unconvinced by those who believe that you can have a secular level playing field. And Bob alluded to this in relation to the bikini case on the beach in the south of France. The most wonderful democratic constitution ever produced in history was said to have been written under the auspices of Leonid Brezhnev in 1977. The 1977 Soviet constitution was declared to be the most wonderful and democratic ever written. Of course, pieces of paper are utterly useless. What matters is liberty in practice. And my argument is that states and organizations which have embraced their acknowledgement of God have themselves created a civic space in which real liberty, by which I mean genuine human flourishing, is a hallmark of societies which have acknowledged Christ. And you look at the Western countries where that's the case, and I would argue that that is reflected in their dynamism. I'm thinking of whether it's Scotland or the Netherlands or Switzerland, all a characteristic. Hungary today is an interesting one. Here's a modern state which, instead of secularizing, in the new constitution adopted by the government of Hungary, the Parliament of Hungary, just a matter of 24 months ago, they have expressly recognized the sovereignty of God. And interestingly, the idea of marriage is between a man and a woman. And interestingly, the idea that the unborn has rights. That's all reflected in the first state in the European Union to adopt a new constitution has fully embraced a Christian worldview. And that's because they realize that if having transitioned from a communist state, what they need to do to rediscover liberty and human flourishing is to embrace a Christian worldview. So this is the point I'm making, that I'll give you, before I finish, one case in point. One of the recent leaders of the British Labour Party was a Scottish man called John Smith. He sadly died and was succeeded by Tony Blair. He was said to be one of the great Labour prime ministers that Britain ever had. But he wrote a book called Reclaiming the Ground, which was about the idea of the British Labour Party rediscovering its Christian tradition and roots. And he gave an interview to the BBC not long after that book was published, in which he said he received numerous letters from Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim British citizens, all saying, thank you for arguing that Britain should readopt its Christian tradition, because we believe that in a public sphere where political leaders own the Christian narrative of our nation, we in turn receive permission to express our own religious identity, even though it's not Christian. And that is what's characteristic about countries where the Christian narrative has been dominant. They've created a space in which people of other faiths have been able to flourish. And the loudest proponents of that perspective, interestingly, in Britain at least, are the Jewish community, who feel very strongly that Britain should maintain its Christian identity, because within that tradition, they feel that their tradition is protected.
Any question more? Yep, I think we have a very good and lively discussion, and many issues raised. I'm not so sure whether we could answer all those questions satisfactorily. Yeah, great questions. But I hope that the dialogue will continue, and the Center for the Public and Comparative Law will continue to organize seminars of this kind to see the role of religion and law and their interrelationships. And no matter talk about in Hong Kong, in China, or in the globe, we hope that in the future we'll be able to see you joining our events. Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoy the talks, and personally I enjoy very much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.